Barely recording. Well, good afternoon and welcome to Parliament House. Today I'm joined at this press conference by Police Commissioner Grant Stevens, the State Coordinator during this major emergency declaration, Professor Nicholas Berrier, our Chief Public Health Officer, and Honourable Stephen Wade, the Minister for Health and Wellbeing in South Australia. Well, the first message that I have for the people of South Australia is we've got this. We've worked very hard to make sure that we were COVID ready before we opened the borders last week. I think I told you then that it was always going to be inevitable for us to have some new cases in South Australia, and we're starting to see those come through. And in a few moments' time, Professor Nicholas Berrier will give us an update on the numbers which are currently with us in our state at the moment. I would like to have a special shout out to all the people working in the Communicable Diseases Control Branch. These are the people that are doing the contact traces in many ways. They're the unsung heroes of the global pandemic here in our state. They're the ones that ring people up, identify who their close contacts are, and then get those people into quarantine so the rest of us can go about our normal lives. I also want to say a very big thank you to those people working at SA Pathology and our private pathology labs here in South Australia. There has been an uptick in terms of testing. That was always going to happen, but we've been able to flex up that capacity, and that capacity will continue to flex up. So yes, we have some new cases. It was inevitable, and we're now working through getting people into quarantine as quickly as possible and making sure that the rest of us can continue with our normal lives. I suppose there's never been a better time to go out and become vaccinated. I yesterday had my booster shot, so thank you very much to the team there. It was great to see people turning up for their very first shot here in South Australia. That vaccination rate is good. In fact, I think we're now at about 90% of people, so 9 out of every 10 people aged 12 and over who have had at least one dose. So that's, look, it's fantastic. We're very grateful to that. But there are still some people that need to get that vaccination, and now is a good time to go and make that happen. I've also got to tell you that we remain very concerned about Omicron variant. This is really only discovered by the World Health Organisation in recent days. We have hundreds of cases now globally. My understanding is, as of about 9 o'clock this morning, we had 7 cases in Australia, 5 that have come in from overseas. All of them are in quarantine. We don't know much about this. We are concerned that some jurisdictions in Australia don't have the 14-day requirement for isolation and quarantine that we have here in South Australia. You would have noted that very recently we went from 7 days back to 14 days for all international arrivals as we get more information about the Omicron variant. Some jurisdictions are at 72 hours. Admittedly, they do have high-level testing around that, but we are concerned about that. In fact, we're concerned enough now not only to lift our restriction for quarantine arrangements for those coming in from overseas from 7 days to 14 days, but if effective later this afternoon, we will be putting a further requirement for people coming in from New South Wales to have a test on arrival. This is another way that we will be protecting ourselves here in South Australia. What I can say is we'll be monitoring the situation, particularly in New South Wales, extraordinarily carefully. We'll be looking at it on a daily basis. But now, to give us more information regarding the current numbers here in South Australia, I'm going to hand over to Professor Nicholas Berrier, and she'll give us that daily update.
Thank you very much, Premier. So, not unexpectedly, we do have cases in our state of COVID, and we would be expecting those to be the Delta variant, and of course SA Pathology not only doing the PCR testing, but will also do whole genome sequencing in any of these cases, because it's important that across Australia we are looking for the Omicron variant as we learn more about it. So we have 18 new cases to report today. 16 of those cases are linked to what we're calling the Norwood cluster, and the others are 2 cases from interstate travellers. So at this stage, all of the cases we have in our state are linked. So in terms of the Norwood cluster, there was an event, and all of the people at that event were vaccinated. So whilst vaccination of course reduces your symptoms and reduces your risk of hospitalisation, it does still mean you can get infected, and so it's really important for any South Australian to go out and get tested even if they have mild symptoms. And that's why we knew about this cluster, because we had one person who had some mild symptoms and they went and got tested, and then we've been able to follow up that event and find those subsequent people and have everybody at that event tested. So obviously within the event, and now that we've got those new cases, all of those cases will have quite a number of people that they've been in close contact with. So this is a lot of work for our team to do, is interviewing all of those cases and getting all of the close contacts. Just to add that many people, when they receive the SMS that they have COVID and they're required to quarantine, will also let other people know that they've been in contact with, that they're close contacts. And so ahead of time, people may have already been told from the case that they need to quarantine. Now, obviously, our team need to work through our normal process, which involves interviewing the cases, and that means there may be some lag between you finding out because a friend's told you or a contact's told you and us getting hold of you. But we'll try to speed that process up as much as possible, including SMS messages before somebody has been able to make a phone call. Now, as we get more cases in the state, I just wanted to make it perfectly clear that we will not be able to ring absolutely all close contacts. Of course, we will do the very best we can, but we need to be focusing the work of the Communicable Disease Control Branch and the contact tracers on what are the most critical issues. And so we will be using SMS for some close contacts. And if you want to refresh your minds about the matrix that we are working with, of course, vaccinated people only require the 7-day quarantine, whereas unvaccinated people will require a 14-day quarantine. So the team not only do all of that contact tracing, but they also sit down and do risk assessments of particular instances. So we do have a number of what we would call vulnerable sites. So we've had some cases at a couple of our hospitals and also out of school, and that means that because that is a particular outbreak, we have to have a team onto that particular situation. So there's an awful lot of work that's happened between getting quite a number of positive results yesterday afternoon and then getting on to do that contact tracing, given that it's way less than 24 hours since those results came through. So as the Premier said, it is really absolutely, if you haven't got vaccinated, you really need to get on with that now. I know that for some people that they've been quite fearful about getting the vaccine, but it's quite clear that we do have COVID in our state now, and as I said, not unexpectedly. We also need to remember as a community to keep doing all of the things that we know about from the past, and I know South Australians know all about this. It's about the hand hygiene. Don't handshake. This is not the time to go back to handshaking. When you're out and about, wear your mask and try to keep your distance away from people that you don't know. Absolutely vital for people to get tested if they have any symptoms at all, and to keep it well away from others if you've got even just the mildest symptoms. So that's where we're up to in terms of today's cases, but very happy to take any further questions.
So what's the hospital that's been affected?
So we've had 2 hospitals within our local health network, and the other thing that you may have noticed that we haven't been putting particular exposure sites up, and the reason for doing that, as we get more disease in our state, we'll be following the same sort of principles as we've used before, that we'll only be putting up exposure sites on our web, on the internet, if it's for a public, we need the public to look at it and to respond. So in the cases of the hospitals, it was contained, and so we've already done the contact tracing. So all of those people know that they need to quarantine, and we've done the testing around it. So there's no need for us to make a public announcement about it, but we just need to be mindful that, and I really was just to give you that example, was to explain what our contact tracers do, as well as getting hold of people and doing that more traditional contact tracing.
How many people from hospitals are in quarantine?
So my total number from this morning at 9 a.m. was there was 210 close contacts in quarantine. That number is likely to increase, and we'll be reporting those numbers as part of our daily epidemiology report.
How many parliamentarians have been identified as a close contact and their staff?
So we wouldn't give you exact numbers, particularly with that rather sensitive cohort. And again, we've worked through any close contacts, made sure that we're able to get hold of them and that testing has been done. With particular reference to Parliament, we have had a team on that, making sure that it's safe for Parliament to resume.
Why was the suburbs listed as a site if you're only listing public spaces? That was a private event.
So I can't answer that specific question, but there may be people that had come into that space as part of that event that we didn't have the contact details for.
Are there CBD sites of concern relating to a case from a man returned from Victoria on the weekend who's been working in the CBD for a couple of days?
I can't answer the specific details of specific cases. What I can tell you in general terms is that the contact tracers get the case. They then do the interview. If there's any exposure sites that need to be brought to the attention of the public, that will go up on our exposure site. So we had really quite a large number of tests that came in all at the same time last night. So our team needs to have the time to work through that, and I would be urging South Australians to have a look at our public exposure sites over the course of the afternoon, and I've got no doubt that there'll be further listed.
Is it dangerous to not be releasing the exposure sites? We haven't seen an update since 5:15, yet overnight the social media stream has been flowing with hotspots and locations that people were at, people concerned that they were there, that they haven't been contacted by SA Health. Wouldn't you allay those fears by being more transparent about where exposure sites of concern are?
So, look, just to be perfectly clear, social media is not the place to go to get reliable information.
Yeah, but
just let me finish, please. Just let me finish, Andrea. So, the way to get reliable information is to allow the contact tracers to take a full and in-depth interview with the people who are cases, and then they corroborate that information, sometimes need further information and maybe do a second interview. The results that we had last night came in very late. We can't be ringing people at 2 a.m. in the morning trying to do interviews. So people do need to take some patience if we're going to do this thoroughly and properly and professionally, and when those sites have been identified, they will be up on our website.
Do you know how many people were at that event on Saturday night? Do you know how many people were there? Was it just the 18 or 20?
So I was told that there was approximately 50, so it was a standard event that you're allowed to have. We have a cap of 150, as I understand, on our private functions, and so it was just like anybody else's event.
And are you expecting all of them to now test positive?
Well, I should certainly hope not. One would think that with vaccination we shouldn't have 100% hit rate, and of course the team is working through to make sure that everybody there has been tested. One of the reasons that may have been listed as a public exposure site is because it is a transmission site, so we already know that there was a high risk of transmission, and then to make sure that we haven't missed anybody.
That is not unexpected, but these sort of numbers at this stage, a week after the borders open, is that what you were preparing for and planning for?
Yeah, so if you recall what our modelling was based on, we looked at seeding of 20 cases a day for 30 days. And there will be other people that have come across our border who are cases and did not test, and therefore we don't know about, and they may have passed it on to South Australians, and then we'll get some chains of transmission. So this looks as though it was linked directly to somebody coming from New South Wales, and so that's a short chain of transmission. But I suspect that there will be other chains of transmission, and this is why we still have some restrictions in place, and it's really important that South Australians understand that this is a transitional phase for us. We have to continue to be really safe with our behaviours and to follow those restrictions, and also because we know that we have getting up there with our vaccination rates in our community.
SA Health has told Parliament that there have been members of Parliament that are close contacts. Why can't we know the number of MPs or their staff who have been in close contact?
Because, Harvey, that's not really something that helps the public good. The information that I provide is really about explaining to the public how we're doing the contact tracing. Giving you a number on which parliamentaries and how many of them were close contacts is actually not relevant in terms of improving the public health outcome.
Opposition Leader Peter Malinauskas looks to be a clear close contact. He had a copy with Jay Weatherill. He has not been told by SA Health yet that he's a close contact. He says the only reason why he went tested is because of media reports. Is that good enough?
So we have a result, and I don't tell people publicly who is positive and who is not, particularly high-profile people. But we had results in the late evening, and then our team will interview that person. Now, of course, when you receive an SMS, you are, of course, welcome, and in fact it's great if you as an individual who is the case tell your known close contacts, and I'm presuming that's why Peter Malinakis had that information. Our team have to do the interview with the case, go through all of the places that they have been, and then we'll contact all of the close contacts.
It's midday the next day, and if you can't get in contact with someone that high profile, how can the public have confidence that when there's a major outbreak, more cases, you're going to be contacting people within a short period of time they can test?
So just explaining again, there are some people that may hear directly because we have a very quick turnaround on our testing, and the case will get an SMS, and then you may hear from your colleague that you were a close contact, and indeed that has happened with a number of the cases up until this time. But our team actually do need to take the interview, because otherwise we'll be making mistakes about who is a close contact, who is a casual contact. We'll be making mistakes about which is an exposure site and which isn't. So all I can say is that we have a very well-trained and experienced group of contact tracers. They've proven that they've done this before. We obviously need to scale up, and we've been bringing more people in, and just to say, these people are trained people because we have a reservist model, so we've got people that we bring into the department as our case numbers go up.
But if
we also
it's taking so long to turn around, if it's taking contact tracers so long to turn that information around, wouldn't it be better to just publish the exposure sites so that the public can make their own assessment about whether they need to be tested and quarantined? Don't we potentially then have people who may have been infected running around in the community?
So Andrea, those are the sorts of judgment calls that we make in public health every day, and we'll continue to make them. And I 100% back my team on making those judgment calls. What I don't want is to have exposure sites that are not exposure sites being listed on social media. So we need this is actually quite a complicated process. As I explained, we will have some higher risk exposure sites, and our focus is prioritising those. Because if we didn't prioritise those high-risk exposure sites such as aged care, hospitals and schools or correctional services, as the numbers go up, we will not be getting to where the actual action is. So there will be, as the numbers go on, other exposure sites that we will decide not even to list or even call as a casual contact. And this is a learning experience for us here in our state. The other states, New South Wales and Victoria, have already gone through this. You will see that they don't list a large number of sites anymore, and they are only considering household contacts or work contacts. We are getting through this. We are titrating our response accordingly, and I absolutely back what the team is doing here.
Professor, did you say earlier that it is the responsibility of the person who's tested positive to COVID to inform his close contact?
Oh no, absolutely not. What I said was that in many instances when somebody gets an SMS message that they're a case and that they're positive, that they may get on the phone and tell people. If I found out I was a case, I would immediately tell the Premier and the Minister and the CE. Of course I would do that. But our contact tracers also need to go through their process and not leave it up to individuals to do that.
Why?
And of course that takes a little bit longer.
Why have these cases been moved into a medical hotel? Why?
How concerned are you about the business SA exposure site?
So let's just take this a step at a time, and rather than say how concerned am I, if we've listed it as an exposure site, it means that our contact tracing team, when they've done their risk assessment, feel that that is a particular site of concern and don't feel that they've got 100% of people who may be close contacts, and that's the reason for putting it up as a public listing.
Why have the cases from the Norwood cluster been moved into a Medi hotel? We know that at least one of the couples there would have preferred to have quarantined at home. We were told that people would be able to quarantine at home because we expected the majority to quarantine at home. Why here are they going into a Medi hotel?
So there are many reasons why we might use a Medi Hotel, and at the moment, because we've got fairly low numbers in our state, we may be putting people who are infected into a Medi Hotel. It also depends on how infectious we feel that person is and how much they can safely quarantine away from others. So I can't give you a response to that particular individual, but what suffice to say is we will be using, as time goes on over the next few weeks, a whole variety of different ways of isolating people who are cases.
Where will isolating at home be the norm?
Very difficult to say. It depends how many cases we get. I'm very keen on having people who are unvaccinated to be in a more suitable accommodation, really not just as for a public health perspective in terms of the risk of spreading the disease, but also from a health perspective for that own individual person, because we know they may have more severe disease.
How many of these 16 were unvaccinated or only partially vaccinated?
So all 16 were vaccinated. I don't have the vaccination status for the two from interstate, but given that we have a requirement for people to be vaccinated when they come from interstate, I would assume that they're also doubly vaccinated.
About the epidemiology, if someone is a close contact with one of these positive cases and has tested negative, does that mean they'll continue to test negative, or is it a chance that they may develop the disease in the coming days?
Yeah, so a close contact has been exposed to the person who's infectious, and then they have up to 14 days of developing the disease. Now, we know when you're vaccinated that it does reduce the amount of transmission that you will have to another person, and also reduces your chance of becoming infected and therefore infectious to another person. So on the basis of that, we have a 7-day quarantine period for that person. So obviously the first test is important because it means they're not a case, and then we don't have to do contact tracing around that individual, but they do need to have their full quarantine period, and we require a test on day 6 before they are released from quarantine.
Have you found the original source of the infection? Which table it is?
So we know that this was a function where there were a number of people from interstate. What I haven't been able to find out yet from the team is whether that person has gone back to Victoria or New South Wales. But in a sense, that's immaterial as long as we're getting everybody that was at that event and having them tested.
Professor, you said that
the person is still investigating.
Yeah, so to see who's the source of the infection. I mean, we can make an assumption that it's probably somebody from interstate, but because we've had our borders open since the 23rd, it could be somebody locally.
And just to clarify, in that circumstance, you said that there's 16 people who have tested positive from that event and 2 people from interstate. Were those people from interstate, did they attend the event, or are they completely separate?
No, so it was 16 cases linked to the Norwood cluster, and then 2 cases from interstate travellers, which are separate to that particular cluster.
What state would they?
I haven't got that, but it will be one of the eastern states, so Victoria, ACT or New South Wales.
There's sites linked to those 2 places.
If it's a site that's of public significance, that will be up on our website.
Why isn't Ocean View College up on your website? Isn't that of public significance?
So that would not be considered a public site because the team will have taken the interview from the case, worked out where the case was, and we can work out all of the close contacts without having that listed as a public site. And just bearing in mind, we are moving from what was an elimination strategy to a different, a suppression strategy. And that takes a bit of a mind shift for all of us, including my team in CDCB. But in the past, we would have put huge numbers of people into quarantine, and we would have listed public exposure sites, and we would have had the whole of Burnside Village going into quarantine. But we are in a different phase now that we've got a high number of people vaccinated in our community.
Professor, the Governor has admitted to being a close contact, so is the opposition leader, and we know that parliamentarians are close contacts. What is your response to Parliament being shut down today and high-profile people announcing that they're close contacts? Do you have any perspective on that?
Well, I just think that this disease is a real leveller, isn't it? I mean, anybody can be affected by it, and anybody can become a case of COVID. And it's just important that all of us take those precautions, no matter who we are and where we go. It's really important that we, keep up that hand hygiene, that we stay that 1.5 metres away from other people. And I can see actually a lot of you journalists are more than really quite close in here today, and I'd like to see you a bit more spread out. I'm pleased to see that you're all wearing your masks, and of course if anybody has any symptoms at all, you need to go and get tested.
Commissioner, could I please ask you, we're we're in festive season, there's parties going on, a lot of people are going to be travelling in the next few weeks. Are you holding your nerve here on not shutting the borders?
I think the Premier made it clear, and Professor Spurrier has indicated also that as far as Delta's concerned, we're on the path that we anticipated we would be on. From the Omicron perspective, there are levels of concern. We are watching. We'll just have to see how that plays out at the moment. But we're hopeful that we stay on the pathway that we've put in place. We are prepared for the Delta variant, and I'm obviously hopeful that Omicron doesn't transpire to be something that upsets our plans, but we do have to watch very closely.
So there is a traveller in New South Wales who didn't come from Southern Africa who's tested positive to Omicron today. Will that change the way you look at this going forward?
I think for the last few days, the team that are working on this on behalf of South Australia have been meeting on a daily basis, often several times a day. We are looking at all of the information that's at our disposal so we can make informed decisions. It's just one of those factors we need to take into account, but I think it was already stipulated by the Premier that some jurisdictions are only requiring 72 hours quarantine for people arriving from overseas, and I think it's the case also that other jurisdictions are allowing people to arrive from overseas and onward travel immediately to other places in Australia. That's a concern to us, and it's something we're watching closely. We will be checking the credentials of people coming into South Australia, either through the airport or by road, particularly those non-commercial travellers. So you should expect, if you're coming into South Australia, that you will be stopped. We'll ask to see your entry check SA confirmation and also verification of your vaccination status and your pre-departure PCR negative result.
I want to ask about. Anecdotally, I've heard from a few people that haven't been asked about the PCR test. Is there a direction to officers, obviously, to look at that when they look?
The introduction of the requirement for a PCR test has only recently come into effect. So it's one of those things with COVID. We make changes quite quickly in some respects. That has to be communicated to the front line. Sometimes that does take time. We do change our staff over. There may be occasions when people are not asked for all the details. That does not alleviate their obligations to fulfil those requirements.
What are the QR code checking numbers like, and have you seen a drop-off? Are you concerned about compliance, given we are seeing a spike in cases?
I'm not checking the QR compliance on a daily basis. We're doing it weekly at the moment. I do have access to it if I require it, but the last results I saw showed a significant uptick in people QRing in, which is probably counter to what people might have been thinking. The view was that if it led to quarantine, people might not QR, but we're seeing exactly the opposite, which is very refreshing, and it's another sign that the South Australian community are on board with us and they're doing what they can.
You said on radio recently you weren't sure whether you'd see cases just within the first 3 days or after a couple of weeks. So 20 plus cases within a week, is that at the higher end of what you might have been expecting?
I don't remember my specific comment, but I think it was a reflection that I wasn't really sure when the first case would come or what it would look like. And I don't think anybody was able to accurately forecast just what it would look like. The main reason that we've been able to lift our borders for Delta is hitting that 80% vaccination target, and that meant that the bulk of our population is protected, and if they do contract COVID, they should suffer less severe symptoms, so it's not going to put stress on our hospital system. I went into this current phase of our COVID response not knowing what it would look like, so I can't say I'm surprised we've got 20-odd cases now. I probably was surprised that the first positive case popped up so quickly after the 23rd, but when you take a step back and have a look at how things are going at the moment, I'd have to say we're on track and things are playing out as we would have hoped.
Can we clarify the rules for those people arriving from overseas in other states who don't have to quarantine? Are they allowed to travel on to South Australia without a quarantine period?
The jurisdiction in which they arrive will permit them to travel, onward travel, which includes travelling to South Australia, and that's where our concern arises. Is our obligation set to people who are coming into South Australia from overseas is that they quarantine for 14 days.
The travellers coming into New South Wales, will they face any costs involved with the PCR test? Is that something that...
PCR testing in South Australia is free. And it always has been, and I think that's one reason why we have such a strong uptake, and it's put us in a very good position in terms of having a good sense of what's happening with COVID in South Australia. We are concerned that even though we require people to disclose their travel status as they come into South Australia, it may be something that is overlooked or not disclosed, and that creates a risk for us, and we're watching that very closely.
This might be a question for Professor Spurrier, but
Before you go,
yep, sure.
Tony Franks' speech last night, where she claimed underprivileged that a family member of yours had received preferential treatment on a police entrance exam. Do you have any response to that? Is that correct?
What I will say is, based on the comments that were made under parliamentary privilege yesterday, the ICAC Commissioner has made it abundantly clear that neither I or any relative of mine has done anything wrong, and I find it curious, perhaps disappointing, that a Member of Parliament is prepared to cause distress or harm to other people without any justification to do so. I cannot comment on the circumstances regarding that matter because it is the subject of an active conduct inquiry within the South Australia Police stemming from an ICAC inquiry, so I am not able to talk about it. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask about, when do you expect the genomics to come back on these cases?
So we do have a good whole genome sequence in the state. I can't give you an exact number of hours, but it's within days, so we get it very promptly. The other thing is, when you're looking at Omicron, there is a fast way of looking at what's called the S gene dropout. And so SA Pathology is making sure that they're also able to do that in our state, and it just means that we can see more promptly if we have that particular variant here. So just a little bit on that variant is certainly something that we are concerned about as Chief Health Officers. We have incomplete information about that now. We're expecting to have more information over coming weeks, but it is something that as the Police Commissioner said, we are meeting on a very regular basis, as well as, of course, our Delta cases here, which we don't want to forget about, obviously. But this pandemic has thrown a lot of curveballs, and we just want to make sure that we're in front of that. And I think it's useful for South Australians to know that we are looking at that very, very seriously. So I was speaking to the lab yesterday, and my understanding from them was that they were getting that equipment up and running. So when you do the whole genome sequence, you'll be able to find that. But this is a quick way of doing it so that you can process it more rapidly, and particularly when you've got more cases.
So is it something that we haven't been able to even test for up until this point?
Oh no, we can test for it, but it's more about doing a rapid sequence so that you can see this particular S gene. It's more of a screen for whether you've got it or not, but it's the whole genome sequence that you actually need to do to confirm it. So it's more like a screening test for it.
Professor, do you have the latest figures for how many people were tested in the past 24 hours? Apologies if you've got
no, I think that I have that here. So we've got 8,687 COVID tests done yesterday. I imagine that quite a number of those will be people that have come from interstate, and I really just want to get the message across to all South Australians who haven't travelled. You're going to have to really start thinking about getting tested if you have any mild respiratory symptoms yourself. To be perfectly honest, I had a bit of a sore throat last Friday, and I went and got myself COVID tested because that is just the right thing to do.
Premier, can I ask you about Parliament?
Yes.
Will you be back this afternoon for a full afternoon?
Yes, so we received advice from SA Health this morning, I think between 10:30 and 11, that we were right to go. The Communicable Diseases Control Branch, the contact tracers, had done their work here. There was no suggestion that anybody who was a positive case was in Parliament, and so we were right to go at 11. We met very briefly at 11 o'clock, but then adjourned till 2 o'clock this afternoon.
Are you providing pairs for...
Everything's in hand, and as you expected, that your predecessor's been tested positive for COVID after visiting the state from WA. The governor's in isolation, Parliament was shut down this morning. It's just more of the extreme end of what you might have expected?
No, not at all. Look, the reality is you cannot keep the COVID variant, Delta variant, out regardless. We had a situation the week before last where the Northern Territory, which has very strong borders, had 3 separate cases. So you can't keep it out. What we decided in South Australia was to follow the advice that was given by the Doherty Institute to the National Cabinet. That was the framework that we put in place to get to 80%, because we knew that that would significantly reduce that transmission potential down. Now, what we're really strongly encouraging people to do, those last people that haven't had that vaccination yet, now is the time to do so. It's going to help themselves, their families, their workplaces, and quite frankly, the entire state overall.
Have you provided pairs for the...
We've got this, but a lot of them are anxious about the way it was handled in the past 24 hours and the lack of information. How are you going to allay those fears? Should the processes from SA Health and contact tracers be reviewed so that every time there are a spike in cases, people aren't panicking?
Yeah, look, I'm quite sure there are going to be people that are anxious about opening up the borders. We're the first of the non-COVID states to do so, but I'm quite sure that we are COVID ready, but we are moving to a different stage. If we go back 3 or 4 months, a single case had the potential to close down and lock down the entire state. That's what we saw transpire in Victoria, in New South Wales and the ACT. So single cases lead into clusters and the entire state being locked down. So we were obviously extraordinarily careful. But as we've increased our vaccination rate, we're moving to a different stage. So we're moving away from eliminating community transmission to suppressing cases to try to buy us some time to get the vaccination rate even higher. Look, these are always balancing acts. You've got to make sure on the one side that you keep your, if you like, your state safe, but at the other side have regard for people who have been locked out from catching up with loved ones, the mental health, and anxiety around that as well. So these are all the things that the Transition Committee has taken into account. We adopted that National Cabinet position. We're on track at the moment. The cases were inevitable, and now we're responding.
Has the government made arrangements to even out the numbers in Parliament to account for those MPs who might be in isolation?
Sorry,
So when Parliament sits, obviously there'll be MPs missing because they're in isolation. Are arrangements been made to maintain the House numbers?
There are. Sorry.
Will you government prepare?
Oh, absolutely. Look, there are people away from Parliament for legitimate reasons every single day, and we have a pairing arrangement. And if a request is made, then we will of course grant that request. I think the quorum is only 17, so we need 17 out of the 47 for Parliament to operate. Will be well above that threshold. With regards to Her Excellency, you're quite right. She couldn't participate in Executive Council, so out of an abundance of caution today, the Lieutenant Governor was sworn in as the Administrator of the State. So this is Professor Brenda Wilson was sworn in this morning by the Chief Justice as the Administrator of the State, and the normal transactions of Executive Council took place.
Has anyone on your side of the aisle been identified as a close contact?
No.
Will you be seeking to adjourn Parliament until after the election at the end of today?
Yes.
Do you think you've got the numbers to do that?
Yes.
Premier, what did you feel when you found out Parliament was going to be shut down and so many high-profile people were caught in this scandal?
Well, as I said, we've been preparing for this for a long period of time. I've been chairing the COVID Ready Committee, which looked at what date we would set, what vaccination strategy we'd have in place, most importantly, what resources that we would have in place. There's never the ideal time to do this, so we relied on science, the evidence. The experts told us that 80% for those 16 and over. We've sailed past that now, and in fact, I think we're at 90% for 12 and overs with their first jab, so hopefully in a few weeks' time we'll be at that 90% for all 12 and overs that are fully vaccinated. So we're really encouraging those last people that haven't had their vaccination yet to step forward, roll up the sleeves, have that jab. They were doing themselves a favour.
What did you feel? Were you shocked? Were you surprised?
No, not at all. I mean, when you look at the projections, and of course it is only a model, so you don't know until you get actual numbers in, they were predicting that there was a 27% chance that we could actually have more than 100 cases for 3 days in a row. Now, look, we're nowhere near that. I think we've now had a very few number of cases, certainly less than 30, since the 23rd, since last Tuesday and the last 9 days. I think that's perfectly within the bounds of the model. In fact, it's probably at the lower end.
Have you made contact with Jay Weatherill?
No.
Do you think you should?
No, I speak to him on a pretty regular basis, but no, I wouldn't think that would be necessary at the moment.
Would you still be looking to adjourn Parliament until after the election at the end of today if you don't get through all the legislation that's on the agenda?
Oh, I think all the legislation that is crucial we'll get through. There are always things at the end of every parliamentary session that go onto the notice paper at the next one. This is no different. In fact, I think this year we've set more days than the Labor Party did in their final year before an election for the last 2 elections.
Particularly the electoral bill that's needed prior to the election.
I don't have courage of that bill.
Professor, can I ask one more question? I know I'm going over old ground here, but SA Health sent a letter to Parliament last night saying that some parliamentarians had been identified as close contacts. The government say it's not on their side. Labor say no one's told us. How does that square? Has anyone been told they're a close contact?
We do have a number of people that are close contacts, and I'm not going to be explaining who they are or how many, but we were able to do a risk assessment this morning and allow Parliament to resume, but we needed to have time this morning just to work through our list and make sure that that was a safe decision. Yeah, thank you.
What's the plan moving forward for, I guess we used to see daily press conferences, obviously we've moved away from that. What is the plan going forward for the public communication?
Yeah, so we really want to make sure that people are aware of how many cases are in the state, and we also want to make it clear if we have cases that are linked, because that's important if we're linking cases, and then we can get on top of those chains of transmission. We'll also be making it clear if we have cases that just pop up, and when we do backwards and forwards contact tracing, so not only do we look to where that person when they're infectious may have been, but we go back in their history and try and work out where they picked up the disease, because we can find more chains of transmission by doing that. So we'll be providing information about the number of cases, the age range. I'd like to be moving to a time of talking about vaccinated and unvaccinated at some point, because I think that's important information for the public as well. And then also a bit of a sense of whether it was a community transmission, i.e. we haven't been able to find the link, or whether it was a linked case and expected. And then we also have the other metric is whether they're in quarantine when they were diagnosed, or whether they were not in quarantine and out in the community.
Was the dialing back of the daily presses, is that meant to be trying to explain to people this is not a significant deal? You used to hold a press conference every time a truck driver drove through the state, and now you get numerous cases popping up and there aren't any appearances. Is that trying to normalise the situation?
Well, I'm not sure if we did it every time there was a truck driver going through the state, but what we would be, from my point of view, my job is to inform the public when there's information that will improve public health or have an impact on public health. And that may not be standing up every day and giving you all the numbers. We can do that in other ways, but certainly if we start to see the numbers increasing and we start to be worried about a spread that is more than what we might have expected, and if, for example, we have an outbreak in a vulnerable site, such as a nursing home or such like, and it's important that the public know about that, because they'll need to change their behaviours, and of course we will be doing a press conference in relationship to that.
Great, thanks everybody.